Let's talk about the long history of how members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have understood and argued for the geography of the Book of Mormon stories. As I'll get into it, there are a variety of theories that have cropped up over the last 2 centuries, but I'm going to focus my remarks on 3 and how these 3 theories have been rooted in particular historical contexts. The hemispheric model, that it took place all across North and South America. The Mesoamerican model, that it primarily took place in a limited geography of Central and portions of South America. And the Heartland model, that it took place in what is now the United States of America. And I need to preface my remarks by saying that these arguments mean a lot to a lot of people. I want to acknowledge that, and I also want to emphasize that I'm trying to take their remarks seriously, while as a historian and a scholar, placing them within context. And I can't go into, however, given time restraints, all the specifics. Every word and every particular that I'm going to be discussing today is hotly debated within these fields. My second prefatory remark is that we can't expect, as we are looking at these historical arguments and frameworks and ideas, it's impossible to expect consistency. Joseph Smith was never fully consistent, the LDS Church as an institution has never been consistent, and the variety of people who have put out their theories have also evolved in their ideas over years. Now, believers are going to say that that means I'm being unfair by highlighting how inconsistent they are. And critics are going to say that that's evidence that they are wrong or doofuses or insincere. But in reality, by emphasizing their, on the one hand, deep sincerity in these ideas, but also the consistent inconsistencies, we'll call them, that what those arguing for Book of Mormon geography are practicing are what religious scholars call sacred geography, meaning that they are viewing these sacred stories and mapping them onto a physical reality and not the other way around. That physical evidence and human theories are meant to supplement this divine message, which often means interpreting material through the lens of belief and testimony. That means that framework of sacred geographies often allows multiple contradictory ideas and evidences to exist simultaneously. So in this video, I'm going to try to be brief. Brief I use in scare quotes because I always say I want to be brief and I always go much longer, as my wonderful producer Anthony will tell you. So let me know as I move forward if you want me to devote videos on any of these particular time periods or ideas or events, because I could spin out 10 whole videos off of this one. My first draft of notes for this video, by the way, was more than 4 times longer than my final version. And I'm also, I want to make clear, setting aside the whole DNA debate, because that's important and connected to this, but would take me off on too many rabbit holes. I'm also taking the sincerity of the proponents for granted, and I'm trying to contextualize their beliefs as they change over time. So in this video, I'm going to cover a few different eras. I'm going to start with Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's own statements and what we can glean from that, and then how the church has evolved in those beliefs over the ensuing century or so, with both official and unofficial statements, mostly embracing the hemispheric model. And then I'm going to introduce the rise of apologetics, starting around the 1960s or so, especially at Brigham Young University, that tried to use secular learning to map on to give credence to devotional beliefs, which meant the triumph of the Mesoamerican model, which I'll get into. And then I'll touch on the recent rise of an anti-secular push of those, especially within the United States, who are pushing what's called a Heartlander model, or that the Book of Mormon geography took place in what is now the United States. That's a lot to cover. Again, I'm going to have to skim over a lot, and I might spin off into different videos in the future. But I think this is a fascinating topic, and it's one example of how religion and secular learning often collide in very fascinating ways. We're going to start with Joseph Smith's day, which means beginning with Joseph Smith and his Book of Mormon. But even before we get there, we need to talk about some common ideas that were not universal at the time, but were certainly present, especially at the time that Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. One is that the notion that the Native Americans had some form of connection to Old Israel, that perhaps they were one of the break-off groups of the lost tribes, or maybe they were a split-off group of one of the existing tribes understood in the Bible. In other words, that there is a sense that the ancient peoples in North America, or at least the United States, again, complications we'll get into, had some divine connection to God's chosen people. And second, there is a common belief among many Americans, white Americans, that Native Americans shared a common ancestry, that even as diverse as they appear with their many different languages and religions, they all shared one common background. And if we understood that common background, we can understand the anthropological origins of this civilization. Enter into those heated debates the Book of Mormon, which Joseph Smith produces in the late 1820s, publishes in 1830. Now, the Book of Mormon, of course, is focused on sacred narratives of chosen people and the rise and fall of civilizations, and it gives a few hints to its geography, especially in Alma chapter 22, what's now verses 27 through 34. It gives the wording that has been dissected by many people ever since then. Here's a printer's manuscript copy of that text, but I'm not going to make you read the cursive, although Oliver Cowdery's handwriting is quite good here. Instead, I'll read to you at least verse 27, which gives you a taste of how the language of the Book of Mormon is going to be used by others to try to understand the geography. And it came to pass that the king sent a proclamation throughout all the land, amongst all his people who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about, which was bordering even to the sea, on the east and on the west, and which was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness, which ran from sea to sea, even to the sea west, and round about on the borders of the seashore, and the borders of the wilderness, which on the north by the land of Zarahemla, through the borders of Manti, by the head of the river Sidon, running from east toward the west, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. So you can get a sense there that it is cognizant of some form of geography without many specifics. It talks about a land northward, it talks about land southward, it talks about seas, it talks about rivers. And ever since the production of that text, Latter-day Saints, including Joseph Smith himself, have taken stabs at explaining where this story actually took place, always taking for granted that, of course, it's a historical narrative. Now, many since that time have taken these passages and interpreted to say that the Book of Mormon says that the land exists kind of like an hourglass, a common narrative interpretation. Here, for instance, is a map that the church produced for a student manual a few years ago in 2018. Though I'll note that, as I'll get into later, there have been many who are challenging this model, saying it's more of a triangle or a pyramid rather than an hourglass due to this and that textual readings. In general, just note that this textual overview is both vague and deeply contested, and is going to be used to defend all these different perspectives on Book of Mormon geography. Within months of the Book of Mormon appearing, there were many individuals, Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Orson Pratt, who immediately start speculating on where that Book of Mormon text was referring to and what lands that narrative actually took place. Now, Joseph Smith's own statements lend some credence to his belief that it took place in what is now the United States of America, that the hill Cumorah where he dug out the plates is the hill Cumorah from one of the final battles in the Book of Mormon, and so therefore we know at least the final battles took place in what is now upstate New York. He would refer to the Book of Mormon as referring a history to not just the Indians, the terms they use for Native Americans, but especially the Native Americans who are now living in the western United States, notably those who have been removed due to the Indian Removal Act in the early 1830s. And in an 1834 letter to Emma, while Joseph Smith is traveling through the western territories, or the frontier territories, what we'd call the Midwest now, he mentions in this letter that they are walking through the plains of the Nephites. And then, of course, there's a story of Zelph, which he declares is a descendant of the Lamanite people, whose skeleton is a remnant of one of the battles. However, even as Joseph Smith gave plenty of statements that connect the Book of Mormon language and peoples and land to the United States, he also gave plenty of statements that started referring to Central and South America, representing this hemispheric model. He would reference North and South America as Zion, and especially the Zion that is a product and prophesied in the Book of Mormon. And then in 1841, the Times and Seasons, which is a newspaper he oversaw as editor, published excerpts or references to John Lloyd Stevens' book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. And he mentioned that they were relevant. Here's one excerpt that gives you a taste of how he and other church leaders saw the relevance of the Central American archaeological research. Stevens and Catherwood's researches in Central America abundantly testify to this. The stupendous ruins, the elegant sculpture, and the magnificence of the ruins of Guatemala and other cities corroborate this statement and show that a great and mighty people, men of great minds, clear intellect, bright genius, and comprehensive designs, inhabited this continent. Their ruins speak of their greatness. The Book of Mormon unfolds their history. So you see him merging these stories, these archaeological, anthropological studies of Central America with the Book of Mormon's old stories. But there's complications, of course. When Joseph Smith would say that these stories took place in America, there's disputes over what he meant by that. People back then would refer to both North and South American continents as America. There's a growing transcontinental hemispheric version of national identity. And there are other times when it makes clear that he's referring to the United States. So take, for instance, here's a quote from the Wentworth letter, one of the famous letters he dictates or oversees during this time, providing history of the church, including the Book of Mormon. And here he is referencing the ancient stories of the Americas. We are informed by these records, the Book of Mormon, that America in ancient times has been inhabited by two distinct races of people. The first were called the Jaredites and came directly from the Tower of Babel. The second race came directly from the city of Jerusalem about 600 years before Christ. They were principally Israelites of the descendants of Joseph. The Jaredites were destroyed about the time that the Israelites came from Jerusalem, who succeeded them in the inheritance of the country. Keyword country. The principal nation of the second race fell in battle towards the close of the 4th century. The remnants are the Indians that now inhabit this country. So again, what does he mean by country? We now refer to country as these nation states, the United States of America. But country could also mean a much broader continental sphere at that time as well. So again, you're going to see the two camps arguing. On the one hand, when Joseph Smith is referring to country, he's talking about North and South America, and others who say when he's referring to country, he's obviously talking about the United States. This is where the conflicts of sacred geography conflict with secular evidence, right? That they don't always fit, or when they do, they fit to push a spiritual message rather than rely on the secular evidence on their own terms, which is going to be the bugbear, the problem with these debates going forward. Before I go much further, a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I am grateful for the many of you as we are approaching 15,000 subscribers, how wonderful of a community this is and the great opportunity to share all this nerdy material with you. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member of the channel where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, and most importantly, you know that you are supporting me and Anthony, the producer, in putting in time into these videos. I also recommend subscribing to my free kit newsletter, which I only send out every other week or so with links and updates and news and lots of fun stuff. And I promise I don't spam your inbox as much with them, and it's free. And I also encourage you to follow me on other social media channels, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, where I do shorter videos that often supplement these. And by the way, every first Wednesday of the month, I do a live conversation on my YouTube channel where I take your questions, often on a particular theme. This coming Wednesday, March 4th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, I'm going to be doing a live on Mormon extremists. These groups like Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow, the Bundys, Jody Hildebrand, what they tell us about not just Mormonism, but the current moment in American religious history. And I am pleased to have with me the wonderful scholar Leah Sawtile, author of the book When the Moon Turns to Blood, the best book on the Daybell and Vallow murders. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, March 4th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to Book of Mormon geography. Few individuals were as influential in shaping Mormon conceptions of Book of Mormon geography as Orson Pratt. He's quoted as early as the early 1830s in saying that Lehi landed in South America and that the Battle of Cumorah happened in New York. So you see the origins of this hemispheric model that the Book of Mormon stories took place across the North, Central, and South American continents. And there's some key assumptions that you find throughout his writings and many others. And I'm going to try to be brief in references, but this is the general takeaways. They argued that the hill Cumorah was in New York, that Lehi landed near Chile, that the land of Nephi is near Ecuador, that the land of Lehi is South America, and that the land of Mulek is in North America. And Orson Pratt even installs some of these theories into the 1879 edition of the Book of Mormon, which he oversees, breaks into verses form, and adds footnote. For example, here's a footnote where he identifies Lehi's landing in Chile, and here's an example of a footnote where he's saying the division of the Lamanites and the Nephites is the division of South and North America. Now, those assumptions are taken for granted by the church institution for quite a while, even while the institution itself tries to distance itself from giving official approval of them. So these things exist simultaneously. The church is deeply interested in trying to prove this geographical history and identify where these events took place, while still trying to not take accountability or official imprimatur of them. So for example, here's George Buchanan, who was in the First Presidency, making a statement in 1890 in one of their church magazines. There is a tendency, strongly manifested at the present time among some of the brethren, to study the geography of the Book of Mormon. We have heard of numerous lectures, illustrated by suggestive maps, being delivered on this subject during the present winter, generally under the auspices of the improvement societies and Sunday schools. We are greatly pleased to notice the increasing interest taken by the saints in this holy book. It contains the fullness of the gospel of Christ, and those who prayerfully study its sacred pages can be made wise unto salvation. It also unravels many of the mysteries connected with the history of the ancient world, more particularly of this western continent, mysteries which no other book explains. But valuable as is the Book of Mormon, both in doctrine and history, yet it is possible to put this sacred volume to uses for which it was never intended, uses which are detrimental rather than advantageous to the cause of truth, and consequently to the work of the Lord. So you're seeing this division here. On the one hand, they are cheering this study and focus and really recommending it as a historical text, while also emphasizing that we can't know for sure. Going forward, how is it that there is such a variety of ideas on this subject? Simply because the Book of Mormon is not a geographical primer. It was not written to teach geographical truth. What is told us of the situation of the various lands or cities of the ancient Jaredites, Nephites, and Lamanites is usually simply an incidental remark connected with the doctrinal or historical portions of the work, and almost invariably only extends to a statement of the relative position of some land or city or contiguous or surrounding places, and nowhere gives us the exact situation or boundaries so that it can be definitively located without the fear of error. Again, similar to what I said earlier after talking about the text from the Book of Alma, that it's quite general, even if lots of people try to place specificity in it. Finally, the First Presidency have often been asked to prepare some suggestive map illustrative of Nephite geography, but have never consented to do so, nor are we acquainted with any of the 12 apostles who would undertake such a task. So you see both the pushing for seeing the significance of the history, including the geography, but also not placing an official approval of any of the particular theories. These impulses existed simultaneously, of them still granting a degree of significance or approval to the hemispheric model without getting into specifics. That's how sacred geography works. It can rarely be pinned down. And this exists at the same time that there are lots of audacious and always failed archaeological expeditions to Central and South America to try to prove evidence. And maybe if they came up with more evidence, they would have shifted this official approval process or not. It also, final point on this era, existed simultaneously with the church reckoning with the United States as a chosen nation. Often these debates over Book of Mormon geography connect to the idea of whether the United States of America is the chosen nation, given some of the passages in the Book of Mormon. But we also see at the same time them speaking of North and South America as chosen status of what God is coming. And this is a complicated, paradoxical relationship between Mormonism and American patriotism that Book of Mormon geography really gets sucked into, and is one of the other examples of how sacred geography works as a political, religious, and social idea. And then all of that is going to start to evolve in the mid-20th century with the rise of more secular apologetics. In the post-World War era, as more Latter-day Saints were able to get access to higher education and the church became more assimilated into American culture, there was a rise in well-educated Latter-day Saints who wanted to use their academic secular degrees for the cause of the gospel. I've talked about this in the historical realm, but this also happens in the archaeological and anthropological realm as well. Now, notably, with the rise of these apologetics, trying to use secular reason to defend doctrinal, theological, sacred geographies, that does not mean that they're leaving the sacred geography model behind. If anything, it's an extension of it. But it did open them up to some criticism, both by the external world, who say that you are misapplying secular academic literature, as well as in the devotional world, where, as I'll get to in a bit, there are plenty who believe that this new age of apologetics were leaving behind some of the core truths of the Book of Mormon, and in some ways calling Joseph Smith a liar. Now, much of this apologetic group is born out of Brigham Young University, of course, the hub of LDS academic discipline. The formation of the New World Archaeological Foundation in the 1950s tried to remain academic, but one of the pushes, especially for many of those involved, was to provide archaeological evidence that the Book of Mormon could have taken place in the New World, especially in response to the growing number of skeptical narratives and anti-Mormon critiques of the Book of Mormon could not be a historical text. BYU even appointed a team to research and produce a film of Book of Mormon geography. It appeared in 1972, Ancient America Speaks, which emphasized Central and South America as the setting. And perhaps the most influential figure during this time was the religion professor Paul Cheesman, who incorporated both some academic theories but also some folk practices to justify his readings into archaeological evidence in Central America. For example, in this church magazine story or essay, Archaeology and the Book of Mormon. There's also a wonderful academic article on Cheesman and the folk practices by Christopher Smith that appeared in Dialogue. I'll link to it in the video description. The church even embraces some of these new evidences. So, for instance, in the 1962 edition of the Book of Mormon, it contains some photographs of artifacts from Central and South America, not giving specifics of this came from this specific Book of Mormon people, but still providing some evidence and justification that, yes, we can find this secular evidence in support of our theological narratives, our sacred geographies. But the real birth of academic Mormon apologetics was with John Sorenson, a professional anthropologist and a professor at Brigham Young University. He published 2 landmark ensign essays in 1984 on archaeology in Central and South America in the Book of Mormon. But then the real contribution was in 1985 with his book, Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, which was a publication by and really represented the new foundation of ancient research and Mormon studies, FARMS, the Modern Mormon Apologetic Institution. The key insight, and I could go into a lot of these arguments, and maybe will in a future video, let me know if you're interested. The key insight is you're seeing the shift away from the hemispheric model to a Mesoamerican model. That the evidence shows that the Book of Mormon peoples could not have inhabited all of North and South America. That by following this secular through line, it's more reasonable, it's more justifiable to say that it took place in Central and South America. That's where the evidence, they argue, leads us. Of course, part of this is driven by the DNA studies, a topic I said was not going to be a focus in this presentation, but as they realize that the indigenous inhabitants do not have a shared DNA background that connects them to Israel, they need to come up with a different model. Now, what do you do with old church statements? Well, on the one hand, the church eventually embraces this Mesoamerican model in some forms, like when they change the introduction of the Book of Mormon to saying that the Lamanites or that the people of the Book of Mormon are no longer the principal ancestors of Native Americans, just among the ancestors. And that's one example of how this new apologetic narrative, using secular evidence, is transforming the church's own language. But then what do you do with Joseph Smith? How do you deal with Joseph Smith connecting the things that took place in the Book of Mormon to North America? Perhaps the most poignant example of this is Hill Cumorah. Joseph Smith said the Hill Cumorah, where he got the place, was also where the last battle took place. Well, maybe that wasn't the case. And the church had been quite consistent throughout the first 150 years of its existence that there was no two Hill Cumorahs, that the one Hill Cumorah in New York was the same Hill Cumorah at the massive battle at the end of the Book of Mormon. But in 1993, the church's first presidency shifts and instead says that we don't know for sure. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. You also see some arguments among Latter-day Saint apologists pushing for the Mesoamerican model, saying that Joseph Smith never claimed a revelation. It was just him speaking as a man, him trying to interpret the Book of Mormon just like us. In other words, we can take Joseph Smith's teachings on the Book of Mormon on doctrinal matters, but when it comes to geography, maybe he could have been wrong. And that does not sit well with a number of Latter-day Saints. Because in the last 2 decades or so, we have seen a rise in those who are pushing what I call an anti-secular narrative of the church, in which church historians, church apologists have taken the wrong road, have been adopting the methods of the world rather than the doctrines of salvation. They come to be known as Heartlanders. The Heartlanders arguing that the Book of Mormon actually took place where Joseph Smith claimed it was, would be how they frame it, which was in the United States. Now that push, this Heartlander model, is driven by 2 things. One, a sacred geography, that we have to take Joseph Smith seriously. Joseph Smith in the early church taught that these events took place in the United States, setting aside what Joseph Smith and others said about Central and South America. But Joseph Smith said that we have the Hill Cumorah, we have Zelf, we have the plains of the Nephites, and so forth. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if the sacred geography is one thing, a sacred patriotism is another, and that they want to emphasize the chosen status of the United States. And this is often an extension of a particularly unique Mormon brand of Christian nationalism, that if the Book of Mormon is supposed to dictate that the United States is a chosen nation, then the geography needs to reflect that as well, which is why you often see that sacred geography and Christian nationalism go hand in hand in the Heartlander models. The most influential figure in this movement is probably Rod Meldrum, an independent scholar who in 2009 co-authored a book with Bruce Porter titled Prophecies and Promises, the Book of Mormon and the United States of America. It used some fringe sciences and doctrinal truths to emphasize this principle of sacred geography, that the United States is a chosen land. Joseph Smith said it took place here. This is evidence that why the Book of Mormon took place. Meldrum was not alone. There were plenty of others like Jonathan Neville, and then a host of websites, blogs, independent books, and gatherings that emphasize this Heartlander model as really a populist uprising in the sense of defending the sacred geography that they believe originated with Joseph Smith. You can find many of their presentations at the Firm Foundation Expo, which takes place every year. The next one's taking place in April. These meetings, as you can see with the flags going, filling the stage, is a blending of both religious nationalism and anti-secular apologia. The key ideas are that Joseph Smith has to be trusted, that the United States is a chosen land, and that we can't trust this secular academic work that is moving us away from the truth. This is a declension narrative of the church losing its core, and it has broader value. These are often the same circles that argue that Joseph Smith did not use seer stone. That's another example of modern secular historians perverting the truth. You get from these same circles those who say that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. Again, a declension narrative. Joseph Smith was pure. Don't be placing your modern corruptions on him. The denunciation of these wicked scholars. The Joseph Smith Foundation is one example of these groups pushing many of these messages in tandem. And there has been heated disputes now for the last couple decades between these Heartlander models and the Mormon apologetics. And at the heart of that is a definition of how they view sacred geography. What truths can be embraced, what aren't? Is the institution in a spiritual decline, or is it moving toward more truth? These are heated fights that I can only touch on here, but maybe we'll devote more in future videos. Notably, today, the LDS Church does not take a specific stance on Book of Mormon geography. This is what they said in the 2019 Gospel Topics essay. The Church does not take a position on the specific geographic locations of Book of Mormon events in the ancient Americas. Speculation on the geography of the Book of Mormon may mislead instead of enlighten. Such a study can be a distraction from its divine purpose. A later Gospel Topics page on the Book of Mormon and DNA evidence also seems to try to affirm this distancing from positions that used to be more mainstream within the LDS Church. And you have several LDS leaders who have come out and said this more forcefully. A few years ago, Russell M. Nelson, right before he became president of the church, said that the Book of Mormon should not be read as a historical textbook, which some people saw, was this Russell M. Nelson giving up the game, that the Book of Mormon is not a historical document? That's not what he said. Instead, he's emphasizing the same sacred geography model that I've been emphasizing, that it should be read more for its spiritual truths, and that should dictate how you read other things. It's not quite any way different than what George Q. Cannon said in that long quote I gave before in saying that the Book of Mormon was not a geographical primer. Now again, I had to skim over this topic. I could have done entire videos on many of these subsections, and if there is interest, maybe I will. But if you want to get more into this topic, I really recommend, if you want to understand the Joseph Smith era, Andrew Hedges, who is a professor in the BYU religion and worked with the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He's written a couple really great essays. One, Book of Mormon Geography and the World of Joseph Smith, published by Mormon Historical Studies, and the second, Book of Mormon Geographies, published by BYU Studies in 2021. I have links to both of these in the video description. And John Charles Duffy published a series of essays in Sunstone magazine titled Mapping Book of Mormon Historicity Debates. This was published over a decade ago, just as these Heartlander and apologetic fights were starting. It also includes cartoons, including this cartoon, that are often quite humorous. I'll add a link to the first of those essays in the video description as well. I also have a link to the Christopher Smith article on Paul Cheesman and the early folk practices to try to provide an archaeological background. Let me know if there are topics you want me to do a deeper dive on related to this in future videos. This video, as you can see, has already gone too long, but I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please hit the like button, share with others so we can broaden the discussion. History has never been more relevant than it is now because it allows us to provide background to these ideas that many might take for granted, but are deeply contested both within the past and in the present, and tell us a lot about how religion is cultivated and maintained.